In the Christian Bible, the book of Hebrews repeatedly advances the idea that Jesus was a high priest. Now, the reason for this is not very difficult to understand. Christianity is a religion based upon the belief that Jesus was the Christ, the Greek word for Messiah. The fatal problem for the Christian enterprise is that it's obvious that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. There were about 10 undisputed and central prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures that all speak about the Messiah and identify the Messiah as the King of Israel. Virtually all of the Messianic prophecies in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, refer to the Messiah as a descendant of King David, the great King of Israel. The Messiah will be in this royal line. And the truth is, Jesus did not fulfill any of the things that this king is supposed to fulfill. To bring about the ingathering of all the Jewish people to the land of Israel, to bring about a life of peace for the Jewish people living in Israel, to inaugurate a world of peace and a world where every human being believes in God. None of this happened in the days of Jesus. But for our purposes tonight, just think about the idea that Jesus was never a king in Israel, not for 1 minute of his life. He was never anointed as a king of Israel, and he never ruled as a king of the Jewish people. Now, Christians can kick and scream and insist that Jesus was the king of Israel, but that doesn't make him the king of Israel. There's a famous story told about Abraham Lincoln. He was an attorney, and in a trial, he once asked someone, if you take a jackal and you call his tail a leg, how many legs does the jackal have? And the fellow said, 5. He's got 5 legs. And Lincoln said, no, the jackal only has 4 legs. Calling his tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. So the only way that Christianity was able to survive the crucifixion of Jesus, where his life ended, nothing accomplished, did not reign as king, did not fulfill any of the Messianic prophecies. So the only way Christianity was able to survive that catastrophe was to invent for him an alternative job description that it could be claimed that he did fulfill. Now, this makeover of the Messianic idea involved, of course, insisting that Jesus will fulfill the kingly role of the Messiah when he returns one day. But the main aspect of this makeover of the Messianic job description was to claim that Jesus was not only a king, but he was a high priest. And he fulfilled the priestly role of the Messiah by dying as a sacrifice to atone for the sins of those who would believe in him. Now, there are a myriad of problems with this idea of Jesus dying for the sins of the world, and we're not going to go into the whole litany of why this idea itself completely is contradicted by the teachings of the Bible about how we atone for our sins. But what I wanted to look at now is a technical problem. This problem is that the royal line in the Torah and the priestly line in the Torah come from 2 different tribes. Kings descend from the tribe of Judah, and specifically through King David and through his son Solomon. And priests descend from the tribe of Levi, and specifically through his descendant Aaron. Now the Gospels, the part of the Christian Bible that is the biography of Jesus, the Gospels spend a lot of time trying to connect Jesus back to the line of David in Matthew chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3. And there are numerous problems with these genealogies, which we're not going to discuss now. However, if indeed Jesus does descend from King David, which would be important in order to allow him to be a king, because every king had to be a descendant of David. So if Jesus really was from the line of David, then he could never be a high priest, because the priestly genealogy comes from a different family. It is impossible to be a descendant of Aaron from the tribe of Levi, and at the same time to be a descendant of David from the tribe of Judah. It is a mathematical impossibility. So what are Christian apologists to do? So what they have attempted is to try and prove that the roles of king and prophet could be combined into one person. And I'm going to try to respond to two of the proofs that they try to marshal to make this point. One proof they cite is from the first book of Samuel, Samuel 1, chapter 21. And in this chapter, King David and his men were fleeing from King Saul. We know King Saul, who was David's father-in-law, was bent on killing David. He was tracking him down to kill him. He was jealous of David. He was furious with David. And much of the story of David and Shaul, unfortunately, is Shaul trying to track David down to kill him. So in chapter 21, David and his men are famished. They haven't eaten. And David comes to the city of Nov, and he meets the priest Achimelech. Now, Nov was actually a city that was inhabited only by priests. And David asks him, do you have any food, any bread? And the Torah tells us here, the Tanakh tells us in this chapter, that Achimelech gave David some sacred bread. So the Christian argument is that if David was able to eat sacred bread, the assumption is that only priests could eat sacred bread. So you see then that David, although he was a king, also had the status of a priest. And this is the argument that missionaries make, that you see from this story that David was both a king and a priest. Now, one of the problems with this argument is that Christians, like they often do, ignore the actual context of the chapter. The context of this chapter is not to teach us anything at all about the laws of the priesthood and the parameters of priests and kings. It's nothing to do with this topic. The context is simply Saul's pursuit to kill David, and David finally, in a state of starvation, coming to the city of Nov and trying to get some food. That's what's going on in this chapter. Now, we know that priests were normally sustained. How did priests get their food? They didn't work. The priests were sustained by essentially the tithes of the Jewish people. Every non-priest had to give something called teruma. Teruma was basically approximately 2% of a person's produce. So if a person had 100 bushels of grain, they would give 2 of those bushels to the priests. And that's how priests were fed. from people's truma. Now, the truth is that there is an extremely strict prohibition against non-priests eating truma. Very strict prohibition. If you're not a priest, you cannot eat this. And Achimelech would never have given truma to David. The only exception would have been is if, in this situation, David obviously was very, very hungry, and if there was no other food, nothing else but truma bread, then in order to save David's life and the lives of his men, then they would be able to eat truma. But that's only under those two conditions, that it was to save their lives and there was literally nothing else to eat. But the truth is there were two other possibilities of what could be eaten. There was what is referred to as the lechem hapanim, the showbread. Now, the book of Leviticus, chapter 24, verses 5 to 9, tells us about this special procedure. It was a ceremony that took place in the tabernacle and then in the temple, where they would put 12 loaves of bread on this table. There was a special table called the shulchan, and every Shabbat this bread was replaced with new loaves of bread. So it might have been possible, and actually it seems from the text here in 1 Samuel 21, it speaks about showbread. It doesn't speak about giving him truma. So it seems that that is the most likely possibility, that Achimelech probably gave David the leftover showbread that was taken off the table from the previous week and gave it to David and his men. But there was a condition. Achimelech says, since this is holy bread, you can only eat it if you are ritually pure, if you have not become ritually impure. And we see in this chapter, in verses 5 to 6, that David assures Achimelech that him and his men are all ritually pure. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that he was given what are referred to as lachme toda, the thanksgiving offering, when people brought what was called the korban toda, the thanksgiving offering. So along with it came many loaves of bread. And actually this could be eaten with no problem by a non-Kohen, by a non-priest, again, as long as they were not ritually impure. But there's nothing in this chapter that tells us that David had the status of a priest who could eat truma. Now, another point here, and this is important to remember, is that the Christian misinterpretation of this story would imply that all of David's men had the status of priests. If what the Christian argument is true, that anyone that eats from the consecrated breads has the status of a priest. So it doesn't only apply to David. As a matter of fact, if you read the chapter, David doesn't speak about himself eating so much. He seems to be speaking primarily about getting this food for his men. So no one would suggest that all of the people in David's fighting army, his platoon, that they all became priests now because they ate from this bread. That is absurd. It's important again to remember that nowhere in this chapter does it say that David had the status of a Kohen, of a priest. The context reveals that there was nothing out of the ordinary here in terms of what happened. Because David was famished and his men were famished, and Achimelech had to give them something. He gave them what was the most permissible thing to give them, which was probably the showbread, which they could have eaten if they weren't ritually impure, or the lachme toda, the thanksgiving offering breads, which would have been perfectly fine to eat again as long as they were not impure. But there's no indication that he gave them the truma, which for sure non-priests cannot eat again unless they are starving and there is absolutely no other food to eat. So Christians with this argument are basically grasping for straws. A second argument that's made by Christian apologists comes from Psalm 110. In Psalm 110 it says about King David that it says, "You are a priest forever according to the manner of Melchizedek." David is told, you are a priest forever according to the manner of Melchizedek. Now, what is this referring to? Who was Melchizedek? And what does it refer to when it says according to a priest according to the manner of Melchizedek? How was he a priest? So we know about Melchizedek from the book of Genesis. He was an important personality during the time of Abraham. But it's important to remember that in the book of Genesis, this was long before the tabernacle and the Levitical priesthood. The only time we see the sacrificial role, the role of offering sacrifices, limited to a particular group of people is in the book of Exodus, when the priests, the Kohanim, descendants of Aaron from the tribe of Levi, they are given the specific role of offering sacrifices, and no one else could do it. But here, by Melchizedek, we're in the book of Genesis. There was no tabernacle. There was no rule about exclusive roles for offering sacrifices. In the book of Genesis, anyone could offer a sacrifice. Not just Melchizedek. Any person that was motivated to bring a sacrifice, an offering, usually for thanksgiving to God, anyone could do it. There was no exclusive role for anyone, and obviously Melchizedek didn't have that kind of a role as a priest. So what does it mean when we're told that Melchizedek was a priest? That David will be a priest forever, like in the manner of Melchizedek. In what way was Melchizedek a priest? So we see in Genesis chapter 14, verse 8, that Melchizedek was referred to as the king of Shalem. He was the king of Shalem. One of the things we know about priests is that they had to administer justice. We see in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verse 9, that one of the responsibilities of the priesthood was not just to offer sacrifices. We're told that priests had to administer justice. So this would be probably more likely what it's speaking about when it speaks about Melchizedek being a priest, because he was a king, and he had this role as a king, as a leader of a people, to administer justice. And the truth is that we see this idea in the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, which speaks about the Messiah, the Messianic king from the line of David, and it tells us that one of the main tasks, one of the main responsibilities of the Messianic king will be to judge the people and administer justice. So when it says that David is a priest in the manner of Melchizedek, it means that he shared this role, this priestly role that Melchizedek had as a king, which David was as well, in terms of administering justice. But the truth is that the great mistake here that missionaries make is to assume that whenever you have the word priest, that by definition it's referring to the task of offering sacrifices. And that's simply not true. For example, all of Israel, every Jew is referred to as a priest. In the book of Exodus, chapter 19, verse 6, God calls us a mamleches kohanim, a kingdom of priests. And in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 61, verse 6, it also refers to the people of Israel as priests. In what way were we priests? Because we know that we didn't have any role in offering sacrifices. That was limited among Jewish people just to the family of Aaron. So if the sacrificial role of priesthood was limited to the role of Aaron, in what way was the rest of Israel priests? So the truth is that there are other roles for priests other than offering sacrifices. And by the way, this makes a lot of sense, because there were many priests, and there were many priests, many more than could possibly fit into the temple at one time. And the truth was, the average priest only served in the temple offering sacrifices 1 or 2 days in the entire year. So what did the priest do for the rest of the year? Right? They had a rotation, and priests would basically only get 1 or 2 days in the year to serve in the temple and to be involved with sacrifices. So what was the priestly role? Obviously, it was much more than just bringing sacrifices. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 10, verse 11, we're told that priests are to teach the children of Israel the decrees of God, and that's their role, and that's what most priests did for most of the year. Don't forget that priests did not have to work. They were supported by the tithes of the nation, and that allowed them to spend most of their time during the year studying Torah and teaching Torah. And we see this as well in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 10, where Moses is blessing the tribes, and he blesses the tribe of Levi by saying, "They shall teach your ordinances to Jacob and your Torah to Israel." So that's how he blesses this tribe, primarily as a teaching tribe. We see in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 44, verses 23 to 24, priests shall instruct the people. And we know that in the book of Malachi, the last of the prophetic books, in chapter 2, a chapter that's all about the priesthood and the priests, it says that the teaching of truth was in the mouth of the priests. And in verse 7 in this chapter it says, "For the lips of the priest should safeguard knowledge, and people should seek teaching from his mouth, because he is an agent of God." So we see over and over and over again the Torah emphasizing that there wasn't only one role for priests, as Christians assume. Priests could have many roles. And so, when it tells us that every Israelite was a priest, what does this mean? So in the same way that the Levitical priests were the teachers of the Israelites, Israel are to serve as priests, as teachers to the rest of the world. Isaiah chapter 42 verse 6 and Isaiah chapter 49 verse 6 tell us that Israel is to be a light to the nations. Isaiah chapter 60 verses 1 to 3 tells us that one day the nations of the world will come to our light. They will be receptive to our teaching. And then we see in the prophet Zechariah chapter 8 verses 22 to 23, it tells us that one day the nations of the world will come to Israel, will come to the Jewish people and say, "We want to follow you because we've heard God is with you." So that's how Israel is to serve as priests. Not as people who offer sacrifices. We're priests as teachers. So we see here that there are 3 roles of priests. Priests administer justice. That's what Melchizedek did. And in that way, David was like Melchizedek, and that's what it means in Psalm 110. You, David, are a priest, like Melchizedek was a priest. Not that Melchizedek had an exclusive role in offering sacrifices. Melchizedek as a king administered justice, and so David as well. To say that David was similar to Melchizedek does not prove that David functioned as a priest in the role of offering sacrifices. This idea is a total Christian fabrication to overcome the massive problem of Jesus failing to fulfill the Messianic criteria. When we carefully examine all of the Messianic prophecies in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Scriptures, we see that there will be a descendant of David who will come in the future, and he will serve as king. Every Messianic prophecy, every undisputed Messianic prophecy in the Hebrew Bible speaks about the Messiah as a king. But not one of them speaks of the Messiah as being a priest.